So you think that Islam is a religion of hate, a religion of aggression? Well, I should like to disagree. I think, considering the wars, the illegal wars that the West have waged on the Muslim world since 9/11, I think Muslim counter-aggression has been very restrained. And I think also, if you consider that the Israeli regime, the Western-backed Israeli regime, has ethnically cleansed the whole swathe of Palestine and kept millions of Muslims in the ghettos of the West Bank and Gaza, I think Muslim aggression has been very restrained indeed. So I do see this as Western aggression against the Muslim lands, and so why is that? Why is that aggression there? And sure, it's about oil supply, regional domination. That's another aim, but I think there's something far deeper. I think there's something very scary there, and I think that's biblical prophecy. And don't turn off, don't turn off. I know biblical prophecy. It's not everybody's subject, but the thing is, it doesn't matter whether or not you believe in biblical prophecy. The fact is that between a quarter and a third of American voters, they believe in biblical prophecy. They believe in the War of Armageddon, because without the War of Armageddon, there'll be no second coming of Jesus. And what happens with the second coming of Jesus is he scoops up all these nice Christian Zionists and he takes them up to heaven. This is known as the rapture, and it's prophesied in the book of Revelation. I'd like to start off with a couple of quotes from evangelical preachers. This one's John Hagee. Now, John Hagee has a megachurch in Texas with a congregation of 20,000. But more than that, he's beamed into the homes of 99 million Americans per week. That's through 160 TV stations, 50 radio stations, and just numerous Christian Zionist publications. And he's not alone. There's up to 80,000 Christian Zionist preachers in America. Not all of them have his reach, of course, but there's Hal Lindsey, Ron Parsley, Pat Robertson, and Jerry Falwell, who have similar sized ministries and similar reach into American homes. So this is John Hagee, and this is 2006 in Washington, D.C., in the presence of 4 US senators and the Israeli ambassador to the USA. John Hagee stated, "The United States must join Israel in a preemptive military strike against Iran to fulfill God's plan for both Israel and the West. A biblically prophesied end-time confrontation with Iran, which will lead to the rapture, tribulation, and the second coming of Christ." Now, this was spoken while Ahmadinejad was president of Iran, and the Christian Zionists believed at the time that Ahmadinejad was the Antichrist. But he wasn't the first Antichrist, or the only Antichrist. Before Ahmadinejad, it was Gorbachev from the Soviet Union, and then it was Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And it just seems to me that the Antichrist has many forms, and those forms are anyone that Israel doesn't like. So most Christian Zionists, Hagee, Lindsey, Falwell, seem to have a very pessimistic view of the future. For example, Hal Lindsey states, "Look what's happening in the Middle East. Ground zero in the end times events. This phony peace deal in the Middle East thus only ensures that eventually there will be a thermonuclear holocaust in the Middle East. This seems to parallel predictions in Revelation. Mark my words, it will happen." So as you can see, there's a real build-up of tension there. As I say, this is beamed into the homes of 100 million Americans per week. So the narrative is very much Armageddon, very much apocalyptic end times. This is F. Furley Kearley, head of graduate studies at Abilene Christian University, and in his book The Middle East Crisis in Biblical Perspective, he says, "When the concept of Armageddon is raised, those who believe in literal war at Armageddon often feel that Christians should work to start this war and should vigorously participate in it. Those who view the present situation as Armageddon believe that Christians should support Israel with vigour and urge our government to take an active part in the conflict in the Middle East." Now, I don't know about you, but this kind of rhetoric is quite scary. First of all, because of its apocalyptic contents, but also because it's spoken by enormously influential mainstream Christian leaders. And it's a little bit unfair to call them Christian leaders. This is they're Christian Zionist leaders. Christian Zionism is a bit of a bastardization of ordinary Christianity, and we'll take a little look into that later, and we'll see who they are and what they believe. And what reach they have. But before we do that, we'll take a look at the end time events. Really, we'll have a look at the rapture, the tribulation, the second coming of Christ, the apocalypse, the war of Armageddon, all coming soon to a world near you. And here we have our friend John Hagee again.
Therefore, it is time for America to embrace the words of Senator Joseph Lieberman and consider a military preemptive strike against Iran to prevent a nuclear holocaust in Israel and a nuclear attack in America.
I'd like to stress right here now that I'm not a Christian. I found the research on this really quite difficult. But in a way, that's a good thing, because there's an awful lot of this on the internet. It'll all be in the show notes. You'll be able to listen, read for months if you wish. But in a way, a lot of it is theologians talking to theologians, Christians talking to Christians. And I think because of that, it's a little bit impenetrable to the average man. And this is an incredibly important subject, and I don't see it being raised. I don't see very much. Appreciation of it in the political circles that I move in. So, in a way, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to be a layman, bringing it to the layman. But that does mean that I also lack the nuance and the very deep understanding that other people can give you. But as I say, there's plenty in the show notes there for you to go and get a deeper understanding elsewhere. So according to biblical prophecy, the book of Revelation, this is somehow how the end of the world, the end times will pan out. And I must say here that the Christian Zionist version of this is different to the Christian version in many ways, and we'll discover why that is a little bit later. But the first thing that has to happen is that the Jews have to rebuild the third temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in somewhere around about 500 BC, and the second one was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So, as I say, the Jews now feel that they have to rebuild the third temple. Not all Jews, of course, only the religious Zionists. The problem with this is that the site they need to rebuild it on, the Temple Mount, is actually occupied at the moment by a mosque. And it's not just any mosque, it's the third holiest site in Islam, after Mecca and Medina, which are both in Saudi Arabia. So the Jews would need to demolish the Dome of the Rock to rebuild their temple. Now, the Temple Mount only measures 500 by 300 metres, and it's been fought over for centuries. Hal Lindsey, another one of our evangelical preachers, once said, I believe the fate of the world will be determined by an ancient feud over 35 acres of land. And yeah, this is where this is all leading, really. And so we might think that this biblical prophecy, nothing's really happening about it. But the building of this third temple is actually going ahead already, not actually on the site. But it's estimated that Christian Zionists in America, American Christian Zionists, are raising about $100 million a year towards rebuilding this temple. And parts of it are already built. All the ornate carvings, all the ceremonial paraphernalia, it's all there ready to go. Some of the carvings are being done for the temple. And also, every year, there's a flatbed lorry, and on that flatbed lorry go a couple of the foundation stones for the temple. And every year they drive it up the Temple Mount towards the Dome of the Rock, and every year they get a little bit nearer and a little bit nearer, but every year the Muslims are there battling against that. So that's an ongoing conflict between the Muslims and the Jews there. So this is Gershon Salomon of the Temple Mount Faithful, and he insists that the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem must be destroyed, and he says the Israeli government must do it. We must have a war. There will be many nations against us, but God will be our general. I'm sure this is a test that God is expecting us to move the dome with no fear from other nations. The Messiah will not come by himself. We should bring him by fighting. So after the temple's rebuilt, we have armies surrounding Jerusalem. There then follows a period of 7 years known as the tribulation, when the world will be in chaos and nation will fight nation, and Jerusalem will be attacked by its enemies. So once the temple's rebuilt, the Antichrist will come and destroy it along with most of Jerusalem. It's this destruction which triggers the second coming of Jesus. Now, in the Christian Zionist interpretation of events, his first second coming, because in Christian Zionism there's more than one second coming, the first second coming is a secretive thing. So Jesus returns to earth, he gathers all his faithful to him, and he whisks them all off to heaven. This is known as the rapture, but he'll return again shortly, and this time he'll be seen by everybody. But for those left behind, things just get worse. The 7 years of the tribulation continue. And according to the website Rapture Ready, after the rapture, the prophecy section in all Christian bookshops will be cleaned out, and you may need reservations to attend Sunday church services. The world will be in a state of supreme chaos, and out of this mess will arise a man who will have an answer to every question. This man, the Antichrist, will be the greatest salesman in history, because he will sell the people the biggest lie ever. Satan will be so impressed with him that it will give this man his full power. At the end of this tribulation there will be a great war known as Armageddon, and Jesus will return visibly, defeat the Antichrist, and reign on earth for 1,000 years. So, there you go. Now, Armageddon is the concept of a massive war that's going to change the world as we know it. But it's not only that. A few people know that actually Armageddon is a physical place. It's on the borders of Syria and Israel. So that brings a little bit of reality to it. Now, this area now, at the moment, is the site of what some people might call the Syrian Civil War, but those in the know that actually the Syrian Civil War is a proxy war between the USA and Russia. So I don't think we need too much imagination to envisage a world war breaking out there in the near future, especially with so many, particularly American Zionists, working towards that very aim. In his book The Final Battle, Hal Lindsey claims, Israel's in for a very rough time. The Jewish state will be brought to the brink of destruction. The land of Israel and the surrounding area will certainly be targeted for nuclear attack. Iran and all the Muslim nations around Israel have already been targeted with Israeli nukes. All of Europe, the seat of power of the Antichrist, would surely be a nuclear battlefield, as would the United States. Zechariah gives an unusual detailed account of how hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the Israel battle zone will die. Their flesh will be consumed from their bones, their eyes from their sockets, their tongues from their mouths while they stand on their feet. This is exactly the sort of thing that happens from the intense radiation of a neutron-type bomb. Well, so Christian Zionists believe that world events are leading to this climatic war and Christ will return to intervene. And as we say, Jesus will reign on earth in Jerusalem for 1,000 years. So at the end of that millennium, at the end of the 1,000 years, the last judgment is going to occur, and Satan will be destroyed, and the kingdoms of heaven and earth will be renewed. Christ's earthly kingdom will merge into his heavenly kingdom. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds to me like we're all going to die and maybe go to heaven. So let's sum up. So between a quarter and a third of American voters, and very rich influential voters at that, not only believe in, but are joyfully working towards World War III so that Jesus will come back and whisk them off to heaven. So this, in my opinion, is why America's not particularly worried about global warming, planetary destruction, starvation, war, or indeed their 19 trillion national debts. I mean, it's all in prophecy. It's all meant to be. So why pay your debts if you expect to die tomorrow? So, in my opinion, it's not really the Muslims we need to be afraid of fomenting war. It's the Christian right in America. And this is basically religious fundamentalism. It's a false religious fundamentalism, a false Christian fundamentalism, and I do believe it's just as bad, just as destructive as any Islamic fundamentalism that we see. So who are these Christian Zionists then, and how did they come to believe in such an apocalyptic future, and believe in it so thoroughly they're willing to give all their time and money to fomenting this end times war of Armageddon that's going to destroy the world? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the evangelicals and the Southern Baptists are the main instigators in in America. There's also a small population of Jewish Zionists who believe in a similar theme, and a large percentage of the Israeli population, nearly 60% of Israelis, believe that the Jewish temple should be rebuilt. That doesn't necessarily mean that they buy into the whole Armageddon, rapture, end times thing, but they certainly believe that the temple should be rebuilt, and are obviously accepting of the trouble that's going to cause with Islam. They're quite easy to identify. If you ask somebody, do you believe that the formation of the State of Israel is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy? If they answer yes, then the chances are you've got a Christian Zionist on your hands. Christians were, historically, they were quite anti-Semitic, really, based on the narrative that the Jews killed Christ. So what made them start supporting this political movement of Zionism, which is basically to forcibly take the land from the Arabs and make a Jewish homeland? Well, it all seemed to start really in 1909 with the publication of what's called the Schofield Reference Bible. Now, a reference Bible is something that, I don't know if you've tried to read the Bible, it's not an easy read. If we consider that the King James Bible, published in 1611, was translated from the Hebrew and the Greek into Latin and then into English, and Old English at that, and then it's been chopped and edited for centuries and centuries and centuries. So particularly, if I try and read it, it's not something I find an easy read, not something I find easy to understand. So a reference Bible is something that you read alongside your Bible, and what that does is interpret the text and tell you what to read, basically. So you can imagine that gives the author an enormous amount of power. And certainly in Schofield's reference Bible, in many places, the footnotes that he's written dwarf the actual biblical text. So
note on page 19 that the footnotes dwarf the text. Note also that the italicized insertions in between the verses that are not part of the Bible. In the 1967 version of the Schofield Reference Bible, there are more footnotes than in the original 1909 version, and since the death of Schofield in 1921, the footnotes have grown to dwarf the text in these very important pages.
So his interpretation of the Bible is very, very thorough there, and it seems that there has been an agenda there So 1909, of course, was 39 years before the State of Israel was actually established. So the Schofield Bible helped that whole Zionist narrative of getting the State of Israel established and persuading the Christian countries to let them do that. So written by Cyrus A. Schofield, and he seems to have been a drunk, a charlatan. He was accused of perjury, fraud, embezzlement. He deserted his wife and children, and then married again only 3 months after his divorce came through. So his reference Bible actually distorted the narrative of the Christian Bible, and it made Christians believe that it was their duty to support Jews into the making of Palestine into the State of Israel. And it's kind of made Christians reject the narrative of the Bible. The overriding narrative of the Bible is peaceful. Love your enemy as thyself, and blessed are the peacemakers. That's all been turned around, really. You can't have an apocalyptic war. You can't be working towards an apocalyptic war at the end times and still believe in peace and love. So it's kind of distorted the Christian message from that point of view. And Charles E. Carlson says that Christian Zionism is the only religion that has war as one of its principles. Because again, the Quran, that's a holy text that promotes peace as well. Ron Parsley, another of our Christian Zionist evangelical preachers, says America was founded in part with the intention of seeing this false religion destroyed, and he was referring to Islam in that context. So other things that the Schofield Bible made you believe that wasn't in the original Bible was that the Jews are God's chosen people. Now, as far as I understand it, the original Bible gives this distinction only to the believers in Christ, and also that God gave Israel to the Jews in perpetuity. God blesses those that bless Israel and curses those that don't, and that a country is in sin if it doesn't support Israel. So you can see how this reference Bible twisted the words of the Christian Bible. So once it was published in 2009, 1909, it was pushed into Bible schools and seminaries, and it was done in order to mould the next generation of pastors and to warp the beliefs of Christians. In his 1927 book, The Gospel of the Kingdom, Philip Mauro states, the Schofield Bible usurped the place of authority that belonged to God's Bible alone. And it does seem to be that this Schofield Bible fomented a kidnapping of the Christian beliefs to support the Zionist cause. So that's the prophecy and the history done. But how does this now relate to the modern world? Well, you could argue that without that Christian Zionist distortion of the Christian Bible, you could argue that Israel wouldn't exist today. Now, it was, after all, the British who had the mandate in Palestine at the time, and the Christian British, who allowed the Jews to go over there and make a homeland on Palestinian land. But I don't want to put too much emphasis on the Christian Zionist influence here. I mean, there was an awful lot going on at the time, and there's many factors there. But certainly that Christian Zionist narrative was instrumental in allowing the Jews to go over there and create their homeland. Now, we know Israel was created in 1948, and it has a great deal of geopolitical influence, Israel. If you consider its small size, it's only the size of Wales or the state of New Jersey. So it's really a tiny little country. So where does this power come from? And this power comes from the Christian Zionist movement in America. It's their influence. All the time, all the countries in the UN, they agree to sanction Israel, and America steps in and vetoes it. It's very often America that vetoes the UN resolutions on Israel, and America has the biggest army in the world. America spends almost as much as the rest of the world together put on defence. So that Christian Zionist bloc actually has quite a bit of say, quite a bit of control over how that military might is used. And no presidential candidate standing in America would ever even consider running if he didn't have a good proportion of that Christian Zionist voter bloc on his side. Here we have the Reverend Dr. Stephen Sizer outlining just quite how much power that the Israel lobby has in America.
The last American president to openly criticize Israel was George Bush Sr. in I think it was 1991. He tried to put pressure on Israel to limit its expansion of the settlements, and he tried to link the loan guarantees with a freeze on the settlements. He urged Israel not to retaliate against Iraqi attacks. He promised Arab coalition partners he would deal with the Palestinian issue. And this is what he said. He said this, quote, and this is taken from Michael Lind, who's a political analyst. He said, there are 1,000 lobbyists on the Hill today lobbying Congress for loan guarantees for Israel, and I am one lonely little guy down here asking Congress to delay its consideration of loan guarantees for 120 days. The most powerful man in the world saying, I'm a lonely little guy. The pressure your presidents are under.
And you can see how much power Israel has by the fact that it still occupies the territories it grabbed in the 1967 war. And the UN have repeatedly ordered it to return those territories, and they're just not having any of it. So this is a quote from our friend Hal Lindsey again, evangelical preacher. Up to the time of the 1991 Madrid conference, the Arabs were called upon to comply, desist, refrain, etc. 4 times. Israel was demanded, ordered, etc. to do the General Assembly's bidding 305 times. The UN voted 605 resolutions between its inception in 1945 and the Gulf War in 1991. 429 of those resolutions, or 62% of the total of the UN's resolutions, were against Israel or its interests. Now, Hal Lindsey and Christian Zionists and Israelis, they all see that as the UN's bias against Israel. But what it actually is, in truth, is because of that Christian Zionist bloc, Israel has so much power and so much influence and so much arrogance that what it's actually done in that time is disobeyed the UN and basically just gone to the international community.